Hey Geneseo, today we're going to be talking about a horse named Dan, and Steve and I will be right back to go down the rabbit hole. Stay put. Welcome back to Hidden Histories. Today we're going to be talking about Dan Patch, and Steve can't stop laughing at me because I can't stop making mistakes. But today we're going to be talking about Dan Patch, and Steve, this thoroughbred horse has quite the history, and let's talk about him and how he has his own ties right here to Geneseo and with Myron and the Olson Farm. There's a lot going on here.
Yeah, Dan Patch was quite a horse because, like we talked about earlier, Dan came out in the time of horse culture and he was the star. He was the star athlete, just like Patrick Mahomes is today everywhere you go. You know, Hy-Vee commercials, everything. Mm-hmm. That was Dan Patch. You know, we got things up here on the table. We got a tin with Dan Patch cut tobacco plug that was put out in the early 1900s with his name on it. To the bobblehead from about 10, 20 years ago. You know, he's still around, he's still a famous horse, and he does have ties to Geneseo. And once again, it's our hidden histories that is coming out. And we've talked just a little bit about it when we were talking about Myron McHenry. And Dan Patch was what was called a pacer horse, and we talked about what a pacer is and how they were, and we're not going to get into that again because that takes us down that rabbit hole we don't need to go down. But he came about, was born out in Indiana, Oxford, Indiana, and he was bred by a man by the name of D.A. Messenger. And D.A. Messenger was a small town, just like Myron McHenry started out, small town horse breeder, trainer, and Dan was bred to a horse that the trainer paid $250 for, and then he paid another $150 for the breeding fee to breed the horse to a horse by the name of Joe Patch. Now, if we'd been in the phone book, that would be after Dan Patch, but since they're not have phones, we won't get into that. But Dan, he was born to this successful breeder, and they didn't put him on the track right away. You know, when we talk about the Kentucky Derby, there's 3-year-olds that go down there. Mm-hmm. Well, this breeder, Mr. Messenger, he decided that maybe I will just keep him around for a while and just see. Finally, he took him out and started training him. He had another gentleman who was 74 years old that was the first driver. Took him out on a little practice track around the farm, and they took off, and the horse about dropped their jaws how fast he went. So then they took him out on the local farm track, or the fair tracks, not farm tracks, fair tracks around Indiana, and he ran 4 races when he was 4 years old. Just 4. That's not a lot when you think of baseball players were playing at that time. They were playing around 150 games a season. He went out 4 times. He won all 4 races. So the owner decided, you know, maybe I have something here with this horse, you know, because we haven't really trained him that much. And he ended up with a record. Now, they raced on half-mile tracks, so they would do 2 laps, and they would get what was called the record. And we talked a little bit about this last time. The record was so they knew how fast the horse could go and compete against other horses with that speed. They were close within each other. His record that first year was 2 minutes, 16 seconds for a mile. So you're figuring, at that time, 204 was probably the fast horses. 210 was where the guys on the big circuit wanted to be in 1900, right around 1900. So they knew they had a good horse, but didn't know quite what they had yet. So at that time, Myron McHenry was the driver of harness racing horses. So DA decided, I'm going to send a letter off to him. Sent the letter off. Myron gets it and goes, yeah, right. Right in the circular file. But DA didn't give up. He sent him another letter. So Myron said, I better check into this. This guy's sending me a second letter. So he he talked to some of his friends in the horse racing circuit, and they said, we've heard that this horse might have something. So he said, okay, I'll go check him out. So he got on the train, went out to Oxford, Indiana, got off the train, saw the horse, and thought, it looks pretty good, just standing there in the field, on the pasture. So they hooked him up to the sulky, took him a couple laps. Myron got on it, took him a couple laps, and said, I'll take him out. The thing is, in 1901, he decided, I'm not going to just take him out on any track. He's going to take him out on the tracks, the big tracks. Might as well just throw him right in the fire, let's not. So they went up to Windsor Locks, Canada. That's where the Grand Circuit was that year. And they had a race for horses that hadn't won. So basically rookies, as we would say in sports. The rookie horses that hadn't won a race yet, that were under, I think it was 220. So they had to be under 220, or they would just have everybody show up with a horse. So they had to be under 220, but they hadn't been able to win a race. Dan Patch and Myron McHenry went out, won the race. What did they win for that race? $600.
Let's say pennies, probably.
Yeah. Compared to what he ends up making in his career, it was a small thing. But he did win, and he got people's attention. Because here's the world famous Myron McHenry, the best driver in the nation, taking out a horse that nobody had heard about and wins the race. So now he starts lowering his time, his record, bringing him down, racing against faster horses. He just kept winning. Well, the first thing he decided is he's got to get him faster because, like I said earlier, the horse had a wide gait in the back, so his feet didn't line up with his front feet, his hind feet didn't. And Myron knew that if you clipped his hooves in a certain way, it would pull the feet in, and they'd go faster, and it worked. That first year, he lowered his record from 216 to 204. And 204 was moving. You're going on the mile track. That was a high-class horse.
That's 12 seconds.
Think of if somebody was running the mile and took 12 seconds off their mile. I mean, that's a good time. And that's what they started seeing here. The problem was, in 1901, when they took him out, they raced him 12 times. He won all 12 races. Now he's at 204. And as I said last time when we were talking about Myron, they were racing heat races then, so it was the best 3 out of 5, 4 out of 7. So you could possibly one race could be really 5 miles. And this horse was running and winning them. He would win in 3. If it was the best 3 out of 5, he'd win in 3. Only one time that year, he went and had to race 4 instead of 3 heats because he was blowing away. He was 5 to 10 seconds faster than any other horse that he raced against.
What set this horse apart? Was there anything unique about this horse that was able to make him faster? Or was it just how he was trained?
I think it was a combination of both. He started out being a good horse. I mean, if you see pictures of him, he looks like a racehorse. I mean, we talk about athletes today, they just look fit when they go out on the field. When they had the NFL draft, they have the combine, they look at it and you look at the lineman, he doesn't have his gut hanging over, he looks like a lineman. Right. He looked like a racehorse. Then, when he passed away, they did a little research on him. His heart was 2 times bigger than the average racehorse heart.
Twice
the size. So that was another thing. And then he did have the best trainers. He had Myron McHenry take him out and get him going. And Myron would say it was the best horse he ever drove. So what Myron did, he decided to do a couple strange things, I think, is a way to look at it. He went out and he found someone to purchase it. Now remember, he was just training the horse in 01. So in 1902, he decided that maybe I can get somebody to buy the horse from this gentleman in Indiana, and then we can get his time down low enough that we could sell it. And that's how we can make money off of it. Because we can't race it against other horses to make money anymore. So Myron McHenry finds a gentleman by the name of M.E. Sturgis. And M.E. Sturgis was a gaming owner. We would call him a casino owner today. He owned places where people went to bet and play cards and things like that out in New York. He decided to team up with Myron to buy Dan Patch. Well, Ms. D.A. back in Indiana didn't want to sell it because there was a star now. Dan Patch was what Oxford, Indiana was. People came there to see Dan Patch. Well, mysterious men started showing up in Oxford, Indiana, dressed in suits and telling Mr. D.A. that you need to sell that horse or things might happen. And he says, no, nothing's going to happen. You know, this is Indiana. What's going to happen? I can keep an eye on the horse. Well, one of the ways horse owners made money off of their stud horses is to breed them. And then they charge. Like he had to pay $150 to get Dan Patch. But now he was charging more than that to breed Dan Patch to other horses. And that's what they did in the off season. When they weren't racing, these horses were breeding other horses. Well, Dan Patch was bred to another horse, and it had an offspring which was a female horse. And the female became known as Dan Patch's daughter. Well, it was named Lady Patch. You know, they were kind of creative with naming back then, I think, you know. Joe Patch, Dan Patch, Lady Patch. Yeah, we could have come up with some other ones. You know, I was looking up information on horses, and I saw some of the horses that won last year in harness racing. One of them was named Captain Crunch, for example. I mean, you know, we got a little more unique names than Dan Patch. But Lady Patch was going to be a racehorse, they thought. Well, before the racing season started, Lady Patch died. And when they looked at it, it was poisoned. So DA decided, you know, it's getting a little hot around the collar here. It's time to get rid of Dan Patch. So he did end up selling Dan Patch to Myron and Mr. Sturgis for $20,000. Not a bad investment.
No.
Not a bad investment at all. But now he doesn't have the horse anymore. He has no control over it. But he doesn't have the worries that came with a star. So now Myron has the problem. Nobody's going to race us. How are we going to make money? How are we going to keep this horse in the spotlight? How are we going to keep it? So he came up with the idea, we'll race it against time. So the record at that time was right around 2 minutes. They were going to go after the world's record for the mile. But how are you going to do that when there's no other horses to run against? These horses were trained to race against other horses. They needed another horse on the track to run against. So what are they going to do? Well, they went out and found other horses. They called them pacer horses. And most of those were thoroughbred horses that had jockeys on them instead of carts. And they would go out and try to get Dan to run faster. So he opened up the season, 1902, in Columbus, Ohio, and lowered his record to 2:01. And Myron McHenry said, we could have probably broke 2 minutes, but I didn't want to risk it. Why didn't you want to risk it? Well, it's the first race of the season. If you go out and break the record, now nobody's going to come and see if you can break the record.
Right. It's a disappointment after that.
And you're saying, well, who's going to go out and watch one horse race against himself? Mm-hmm. Plenty of people. In Davenport, in October, Myron McHenry brought Dan Patch to Davenport to their mile track over there, the same mile track that's there today. 2,500 people showed up. 100 people from Geneseo made the trip over to see the horse run. Did he set the record? No. He went 2:01 again, but that was the track record. He broke the track record by 3 seconds. The track record was 2:04. He went 2:03. Once again, he was 5 to 10 seconds faster than any other horse at that time. And he was running against himself. So what else could they do? You know, where could they go with him now? He's 2:01. Could they break the magic number of 2 minutes in the mile? And he said, well, maybe if we continue to push him, we can. 201 was maybe where they should have stopped because it was already October. Racing season was over. But remember, he's not racing against himself, or against other horses. He's racing against himself. So they kept him going. They ended up down in Memphis, Tennessee, and they went 159 with him. So now they have that record. What else is out there? Well, now it's time to sell. We've got him where he's got the record. We need to sell him. What do? They said, sounds good, but now we have to find somebody that's willing to pay top dollar for it. We got to get over $20,000 for it because that's what we paid for him. And we did it. They have all these TV shows about flipping houses now. Yeah. You buy a house cheap, you put money into it, and you flip it for more money. That's what they were trying to do with Dan Patch, is flipping. And they wanted to make the most money. But there wasn't a lot of people out there in 1900 that could afford that. And so they finally found a gentleman up in Minnesota. He ran the International Stock Food Company. And stock food was for your cattle and your pigs and things like that. He also sold stuff that was kind of, I would put it in the snake oil category. It should work, but it might not work type medicines for horses. Mr. Savage, ended up paying $60,000 for the horse. Now, I couldn't find what Myron's cut was of it, but if he even got a third of it, it's, you're looking at $20,000. Right. That's a good punt. So part of the deal was Myron McHenry would get to drive him in 03 and 04 for Mr. Savage was the owner. And the problem with that was they had a disagreement over what should be done with Dan Patch. Mr. Savage thought it's time to make him a star. We're not going to have, races to run all the time. But if we start getting things out on the market with Dan Patch's name on it, why he's hot, then we can have it. And then I can do stud fees for him. So he was keeping him longer and longer in the stud field and not racing him, giving him back to Mr. McHenry to train. And Mr. McHenry wanted him to train him so he would race and beat more records, set more records. And things like the plug. We were looking the other day, I showed you that picture in that book from Davenport with the little girl sitting on the Dan Patch little hopping scooter type thing. Mm-hmm. They had scooters, they had wagons, they had stopwatches. You name anything, spoons, anything that you could put Dan Patch's name on it, Mr. Savage puts his name on it. It was
all about merch.
Yes, it was the merch. Kind of like today, We watch NFL football games and they have different uniforms because the merch. Mm-hmm. They want to sell more, shirts and you got it. So that's kind of what he did. That's how he made it. When Dan Patch died, they estimated he made Mr. Savage $2 million. $2 million in 1904, from 1904 to 1911. That's some serious money back then. So what records did he set? Well, in 1903, he set the mile record. He set the 2-mile record. He went 209. He would end up lowering that to 204 by the time he was done running. He went 204 in the mile. He went 417 in the 2-mile. And then he went 57 seconds in the half-mile. And then they would hook him up to different wagons. The high wheel sulky, he set that record. The regular sulky, like I was on the horse there, he set that record. They hooked him up to what was called a wagon, which was basically had 4 wheels and a board here with sides on it, and the driver sat in that wagon. And then they put the bicycle tires on it so he could run faster. He set that record. Anything he did, he set the record for it.
And who was the driver for all of it?
From 1903, 1904 was Myron. And after that, a man by the name of Hershey took over because Savage and Myron had, remember I said they weren't getting along? Right. Well, that came to a head in 1904 and Savage fired Myron McHenry. Some rumors had it because the training. Some rumors said it was because Myron was drinking. I could not find anything out about that. Well, if he was truly, but that's what was out there. Yeah, and once again, Myron was a star, Dan Patch was a star, and so there was all kinds of rumors out there about it. What happened to Myron after they were done racing him? Well, he continued to try to lower the mile record. He was at 155 within a quarter for the longest time. People kept coming out to see him. In 1906, for example, they were down at the Des Moines, out at the fairgrounds in Des Moines. 40,000 people showed up. They went to the Illinois State Fair that year. 50,000 people showed up. He finally lowered the record to 155. Now, it was unofficial because they said they were using a windbreak on the horse ahead of him. They had a sulky out in front of him that had a shield put up like a cloth shield to break the wind for the horse, and that's illegal in the racing world. You can have a pace horse, but you couldn't have anything blocking the wind. And so they didn't allow that as the official record, but he did have that as a time, 155. 90,000 people were at the Minnesota State Fair that day to watch him try to break the record. They even went out and they put a car on the track and put a camera in there and took still photos of him running around the track that day, and they put it into a flip book. So you could flip the pages and look like the horse is running for that whole race. Once again, all about the merch. It wasn't good enough that he got that record. So then, after he was done with his racing career, Savage turned him loose at what was called the Taj Mahal. It was a horse barn that was built just for Dan Patch and a couple other top-notch racing horses that Savage would buy. And he ended up going to stud. He just lived out his life. And in 1911, at 20 years old, he passed away up in Minnesota.
20 years old?
Yep.
Isn't that pretty good for
That's a real good for a horse, yep.
Yeah.
The amazing thing was, 2 days later, Mr. Savage passed away. He was 57 years old. So it was kind of a unique situation where both of them. But you talk about the merch and all that stuff. They even had a train line, a passenger train, freight train, called the Dan Patch Rail Line that would bring people out to the farm and take people away because it was a tourist attraction. Once again, Mr. Savage was all about the merch, and because he knew he wasn't going to race forever. But he wanted to keep his name in the highlights of the time. Now, people have asked me, did Dan Patch ever come to Geneseo? Because Myron was from here. He trained him for 3 years. Did he ever bring the horse here? Well, I had never found anything in the newspaper. Never anything written down. But once again, back then, when you had things that happened in town, a lot of times the people that were there, like if you had a baseball game, they would say the baseball game was going to happen that day, but it was hard to find out the score of the game because the newspapers expected you to be there. If you wanted to know, you were there. So they didn't record it because everybody that bought the paper was at the game, so why should I write the score down? The same thing happened when people came through town. They would have a reporter at the station at the Geneseo Depot watching who came and went, but they wouldn't record a lot of it because if there's a big crowd there, they wouldn't write it down. The same could have happened with Dan Patch. I did find that in October of 1902, Dan Patch raced at the Davenport Mile. Then on Saturday, Myron was here in Geneseo visiting his mother. At that time, they never traveled separate. Myron always traveled with the horse in the same train. So if Myron was here, either Dan was still in Davenport or he was in Geneseo. I don't have it written down that Dan Patch was here, but that could have been a day because then they ended up in Memphis running a race. So he could have easily been through Geneseo with the horse. I do have an oral history from one of Myron's cousins that says that Dan Patch came through on a train one time and threw a shoe on the train. So they stopped in Geneseo and had the shoe repaired here in town. And that's an oral history, but I don't have anything written down except for that oral history. Oral histories are there because people remember that they happened. Mm-hmm. That's just like what we're doing here. We're taking and we're recording it, we're putting it on tape. Now we have an oral history based on what happened and what we find. And that's what that oral history is. So 9 chances out of 10, the horse was here in Geneseo. But we just don't have it written down in the newspaper that was here. There was other stories out there that maybe Dan Patch was out at Myron's farm that he had, his stock farm that he had north of town. Well, that wasn't the case because he had sold that prior to training Dan Patch. So that didn't happen. He did not train the horse here in town. He was done training horses here. By the time he took over Dan Patch, he was not training here in Geneseo anymore. Because really our first track was pretty well washed up, and Myron's track that he was going to build out at his farm, which was going to be a mile track, never got built because the canal went through that property.
Yeah, there's a lot to that, and the merchandising that goes along with it. And if you're looking for merchandising, all you got to do is go out on eBay, and you can find all sorts of stuff like this. There's so much to Dan Patch and Myron McHenry and how that all weaves into Geneseo. And so thank you for watching, and we will see you for the final episode of the Dan Patch, Myron McHenry, and the McHenry farm.
Yep, stock farm. Yep.
And how all that weaves itself together. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you right back here next time.